Welcome to Metapod, the podcast where we discuss operational execs and organizations that make and move stuff, and our common headaches, digital transformation, the forever labor shortage, and doing more with less. And now, the host of Metapod, Ron Crabtree.
Okay, it's Ron Crabtree back as your host of Metapod, where we kind of focus on those three key areas that every business is challenged by, particularly if you're involved with tangible goods, right? The forever labor shortage, digitization, and digitization of work, as the case may be, digital transformation, and then certainly, needing to do more with less. And there are very few areas of any business that are more challenged in all three areas than supply chain operations, and in particular, procurement operations. And every company I talk to, there's way more to do than we got time to do it and the resources to do it right. And we end up wasting a lot of time. And I'm going to ask Anders Lillevik, who's CEO and founder of Focal Point, will be introducing himself in a moment. But you're going to really enjoy this podcast if you have a purchasing organization and you've wondered about what the opportunities are to make it better, attracting all three of those problems. And this is the guy you want to talk to. In fact, a lot of what he'll share with us is kind of transferable. The same kinds of strategies probably apply in any complex business process where you need lots of people involved with pretty complex transactional activities that aren't really all necessarily that straightforward, nor do you necessarily have everything you want at the right time in the right place to make good decisions. So he's going to spend a little time, giving a bit of a diagnostic, three different areas to look at around cost clarity, cost reduction opportunities, process risks, and then where are the real opportunities for process automation and the digitization of work. So Anders, introduce yourself for our audience.
Yeah, so my name is Anders Lillevik. I'm the founder and CEO of Focal Point. We are a B2B SaaS company focused on procurement automation and opportunity assessments. And before I started Focal Point, I spent 25 years in procurement. So I have been a chief procurement officer for companies like Fannie Mae, QB, Webster Bank, Citizens Bank, and so on. So I hope I know what I'm talking about, a little bit at least.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So get us started here then, if you don't mind. And what we're looking for first would be kind of, for the uninitiated, don't know a whole lot about procurement. If I'm an executive in the C-suite, need to walk down the hall and ask for information, get some evidence, understand, do we have challenges? Do we have opportunities in these three key areas? I'll let you take that from the top.
Sure. So the first thing you want to figure out is get clarity of what you're spending money on. So, for example, you need to go to accounts payable and figure out who are you paying, what are you buying, and then figuring out how you can categorize those data points into meaningful categories. So, for example, the accounting data might not always be the best way of looking at your spend because they look at it from an accounting perspective. So a computer is a computer, and it may end up in the same bucket as a server or whatever the case may be. So the GL structure is not always that great. So you need to figure out how can you then categorize the spend into meaningful opportunities. The second thing you want to do as you have a look at that spend data is figure out what are your opportunities for demand management? So what stuff are you buying that you just don't need? Or the things that you have two or three of that do the same thing where you can consolidate? And the last thing you want to figure out is to what extent are you a term taker for some of these deals? So how do you have contracts?
Wait a minute. We need the term taker, right? That might be new language for some of the audience. Maybe you could define what you mean by that a second.
So a term taker is essentially if you're buying stuff, goods and or services, and you don't have your own contract, you basically just click the button that says, yes, okay. And if you're a very small business, that might be okay. But if you have of a certain size and scale, you should be able to start influencing not just the price you pay, but also the terms that you're getting. So if you're using the supplier agreement without negotiating limitations of liability, the distribution of risk, the payment terms, those kinds of things, you could be leaving money on the table. And whether that is through paying in 30 days when the market bears 60 or 90, or if you are paying retail prices when you probably could do much better, those are things you want to figure out. And normally,
do terms also blanket things like their liability and how much of the risk they're taking on if it's a failure? Is that
Oh,
also usually in terms?
absolutely. So whether or not they will indemnify you if they screw something up, or you will indemnify them if you screw something up. So there are some key clauses you want to look for in contracts. So one is limitation of liability on both sides. Number two is indemnification. The third is insurance coverage, right? And then there's lots of little things too, like logo rights, publication rights, termination for convenience, those kinds of things.
Yep, thank you.
So, but the most surefire way to figure out if you're a term taker is if you can't find the contract, right? Because if you can't find the contract, you probably are a term taker and you've signed their agreement sight unseen, or even words, you've agreed to their online terms, which is danger.
Awesome. Good things to know.
Mm-hmm. The next thing you want to figure out is what are the potential process risks that you have taken on? So, the worst thing is sometimes if audit comes knocking and you can't really explain how a purchase came to be, right? And you have to figure out like what are your internal processes to do certain things like onboarding a new supplier or approving spend or negotiating a contract. And if you have those things, like who participates, who runs those things, and then if you string those policies together, can you walk a couple of transactions through that process and see what artifacts you can find? And I think that's, a really good exercise to do. You take one of your largest suppliers and say, like, how did this come to be? And if you can't find the answer, you probably have a process problem.
So what would be the risk associated with a bad process? Or at least a process we're not following religiously that's documented? What are some of the implications when you find that?
Well, I'm not a lawyer. I know my way around contracts, but I will still never sign a contract without having a lawyer looking at it. Because there are things in the agreement, words that sound very innocuous, but they're not, right? The words best efforts, for example, in a contract means something. Right? It means that you will do whatever you can do to fix a problem. Now, if I say to my wife, I'm making my best efforts, those have the quite same consequence, right? So, a lawyer will say, well, no, you want to have commercially reasonable best efforts or something like that protects you. So what I would say is, by not having a process being followed, you can take on suppliers that aren't financially viable, that don't have the right control environment if they store your data, for example, or you take terms that you don't necessarily know what they are. So that's a risk of not having a process in place.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying that. Again, uninitiated audience, and arming them with great questions and things to look for and evidence that they're searching for to determine, hey, is this an area we need to be concerned about?
Right. The second thing around areas of risks is are you managing your critical suppliers? And a lot of folks don't understand just how critical suppliers are to the day-to-day operations, right? So for example, if you have a supplier that hosts your systems and your data or a part of your customer delivery process, like, are you managing them in a way that is representative of the criticality of the relationship, right? So are you meeting with their C-level executives? Can you meet with the C-level executives? Can you figure out how to strengthen the relationship so that if something goes wrong, you're not the last person in line? The other thing that I would, basically recommend people do is figure out your suppliers' critical suppliers. And by that, I mean, you may have concentration risk that you're not aware of. So if all of your online hosting providers are using the same provider, like Amazon or Azure or something like that, you actually have a concentration problem or risk that you didn't even know you had. Your contract is with the providers. Their contract is with Amazon or whoever. And you could find yourself, like I said, having that risk without even knowing about it. And then you need to tell your suppliers to say, look, you're critical to us. This provider is critical to you. Can you make sure that you manage these suppliers accordingly, please? Now, it's kind of hard to do. It's trying to manage a supplier that you don't have a relationship with, but at least you need to be aware of it and see if there's ways that they can mitigate it. The third thing to look about risk is, and this is kind of an interesting thing, right? A lot of folks are buying commercial off-the-shelf platforms that are built for individuals. So take a workflow platform like Asana or Trello or something like that. And people are using it inside the organization to manage projects or workflows, whatever the case may be. Now, that sounds very benign, but what you may find is that the scope that is being used far exceeds what they actually contracted for. I don't mean from a user license perspective, but if they are now using customer data inside those solutions or uploading confidential information into those solutions, your IT security organization may not know about it, and they certainly
what could go wrong here?
Right, exactly right. So the whole idea is like, if you're using something that is not meant for, enterprise grade, and you're basically, putting all the keys to the kingdom inside of them, you could be taking on a risk that you don't even know. So it's important as you are looking at these suppliers, and there could be hundreds of them, like, are they sticking to the original intent, and are they then exposing you by not doing so? And it happens all the time.
And I don't suppose if you allow rogue spend to go on, right, where people out there buying and, SaaS software and tapping into stuff and nobody even knows they're doing it, that's like a massive headache problem too, isn't it?
Exactly right. And, I'm helping a customer right now, and they're spending, $2 billion a year on goods and services, a significant company. And we see a lot of SaaS being bought in a very similar way. They have 3 or 4 CRM solutions. They have 3 or 4 workflow solutions. They have contracts with every cell phone provider. And we often found that they buy retail. They go to the Apple store and buy retail prices with their credit cards, right? Again, rogue spending or uncontrolled spending is difficult to control. At first, you got to figure out whether or not you have it, to what extent it's there, and then you need to figure out how to control it into channels.
Yeah, manage your risks, exactly.
Oh.
All right, cool. Anything else around this potential areas of risk you want to touch before we get to the third area?
Yeah, no, the third topic's really around figuring out what your transaction process looks like. So what are the gates, what are the tolls, what are the handoff points in your process to make sure that, number one, the right things are getting done and the approvals are getting done. Number two, that people know how to make things move forward. And number three is how automated it is, right? So mapping out, the idea from getting a quote to getting a contract to getting a PO to getting a payment is kind of important. And you need to also evaluate, like, how manual is the process, and does it differ depending on what's being bought and where in the organization. So IT may have a very different process than, say, marketing. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? And then you need to figure out, like, what are the minimum standards you need to adhere to get things done. And I think start with the minimum standards and then add complexity based on risk or criticality or size of what's being bought. The second thing is identifying technology that you're paying for. So, for example, your accounting system may have a lot of these capabilities already, either by issuing purchase order, consuming and matching invoices and paying them. So if you have a lot of technology that you have that you're not using, that you're paying for, look for those kinds of things for opportunities so you can actually start automating things to create visibility rather than going out to market.
Yeah, that's understanding existing capabilities, right? What do you already own, and what can you connect to? What you're describing there, and in part, right? So maybe that's the next layer is what else is available to you to connect with, right?
Correct. So you always have, I read a statistic once that basically most systems are only utilized like 40% of the total capability. And that might be okay, right? But it might not be okay. So if you buy a platform and you only buy it for 2 or 3 use cases, the fact that the platform handles 10 use cases doesn't make it a bad thing, right? Are you paying for the other 7? Maybe, maybe not. It all depends on how the deal was struck. And then again, that's why you got to know how the bodies were buried when the deal was made to sort of have that history. Because oftentimes I will have customers to say, well, we're not using this, so we're not going to pay for it. Well, you're not. I just gave it to you because I did in hopes that you would use it. But, it is what it is. So it's sometimes challenging.
All right. So That's amazing. Actually learned a lot here about, those subtleties I didn't really appreciate. So we've kind of armed our audience with, what to look for, what to ask for, what evidence are we seeking, and where we can't get the answers, we know we have a problem.
Yep.
And putting some scope and scale to it and trying to understand the degree of risk and how much money we're leaving on the table. And then the other thing that really jumps out at me, to do all these things well takes time and effort that they don't have, which means now we got to figure out how we're going to actually do this, automate it, and make it easier for people to actually execute it right the first time. So I think that kind of gets into the advice that you're going to offer us now. I mean, we've got the problem, Anders, so how do we tackle it? Take us into that. How do we fix this stuff?
Yeah. So the first thing to do from a diagnostic perspective is when you go after, try to figure out what you're spending data on, don't go to the ledger. The ledger is sometimes very, very messy. And like I said before, it's all accounting data. So what you want to make sure is that you get the actual transactions as they were being paid, because then you can find out a bunch of things. So for example, you can find out the invoice date, when the invoice was paid. You can figure out the supplier, sometimes the line item details on the invoices. And that's a much more powerful thing than a journal entry that has minimal information in it. Secondarily, you need to figure out what all your different spend sources are. So we have a customer right now who pays about 60% of their invoices through the ledger, another 30% through an online service, and then the additional 10 through credit cards like American Express. And then getting a consolidated view of all those spend sources is sometimes a lot of work, but it's kind of important. Once you have all that information, then you need to categorize that data into meaningful categories. So for example, you want to know what you're spending in IT, and below that, you want to know what's hardware, software, and services. And under software, you want to know, ERP software, accounting software, productivity software, so on and so forth, so that it actually makes sense to you. It's actionable so that you actually kind of know. And you want to also then be able to see how many productivity softwares do we have? How many cell phone providers do we have? And then all of a sudden you can start seeing the opportunities of taking cost out.
You said something important there I didn't want anybody to miss. The productivity tools that are probably already owned or easy to acquire and connect that we're just not leveraging with a lick. And that is a big short-term opportunity to reduce the effort required to even do this stuff, right?
Exactly. So this back to demand management, right? So if you find you have a long tail of different providers that do the same things, then you should look to consolidate that. And then you need to create a repository where the spend data, the contract data, the PO data come together and then start creating opportunities. For example, if you're paying your suppliers in 2 days, you probably can free up capital by paying them in 30. That's a relatively easy lift, right? But accounts payable folks tend to pay stuff as soon as they possibly can. Not good for treasury, but certainly good for them because they're productive people, right? You need to figure out where there are demand management, where there's potential to use your leverage as a large organization to take out cost, where you can renegotiate terms and pricing as well as the contracts themselves. So basically, once you have all this data, bring it together so you can actually make some sense out of it and make recommendations.
Okay, great.
On the second question around risk, you need to figure out what are the policy structures that you can put together to service this, right? So you probably just need to see if there are existing deals where you can retrace those transactions to figure out how it took place. And then secondarily, based on your spend analysis work, pick a handful of suppliers and see what kind of documentation you have on those suppliers. So for example, do you have a validated W-9? Do you have an OFAC check to make sure that you're not dealing with bad organizations?
So wait a minute, OFAC, that's a new acronym.
OFAC is in banking, this is a requirement, right? So it's basically the Office of Foreign something.
Okay. OFAC. We don't have to define it fully, but if you haven't heard that one before, you probably need to know about it.
Yeah, so OFAC checking basically says, are you dealing with a party that is basically banned and sanctioned, right? So it's a terrorist, right? And some organizations that's frowned upon, certainly if you're a regulated entity like a bank. So, but you have your own, right? The own list that you probably care about. So you need to do, payment information, OFAC checking, insurance certificates, control evaluation, regulations, audits, those kinds of things. And also make sure, are there regular meetings with the suppliers, right?
So is ESG starting to come in more of the focus here as well, in your opinion, or does it depend on the industry?
It depends on the industry and the size of the company. I think that a couple of things at play here, right? So number one, up until very recently, the SEC did not put out guidelines for what their expectations are, right? So there's a lot of folks now scrambling to try to figure out what is their tier 3 spend, which is the carbon footprint produced by their suppliers, which is the vast majority of most organizations spend.
Right.
Emissions. I also think a lot of folks are looking to November to determine whether or not they go all in on these things, thinking that if we switch from Democratic to Republican, that the focus on carbon reduction might not be as great as it is today. But we're certainly seeing it, right? And there are ways of getting to this information by just taking the spend data that you have and then applying it to a calculator, so to speak. So $1 spent in management consulting is the equivalent of X pounds of metric tons of gas, whatever the case may be, carbon. Same thing with computers, same thing with travel, whatever the case may be. So there are ways of getting there, but as long as you have the underlying data to support it.
Awesome.
And the third big watch out for your risk is figuring out where are all your SaaS providers, right? Who are all your SaaS providers? How are they tying into your organization? Do they have data? Are we doing audits on them? Are we checking in to make sure that they're staying within the confines of what was intended to? And this is more on an internal usage perspective than necessarily bad software providers. Because if you don't ask for a good control environment, you probably won't get one.
Okay. Awesome.
So then for number 3, in terms of your transaction process, my advice there would be, first and foremost, create a bare minimum process for suppliers who are not critical or risky, right? And to the extent possible, use that existing technology that you have to try to automate that as much as humanly possible. You want to eliminate the manual checks, for example, by validating the W-9, the banking details, whatever the case may be. Like there are automated features for all of these things that can be done today. And there's no reason to, pass paper around anymore, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, you just showed something that's really critical. I want to make sure nobody misses this. So what you're saying is you got to kind of do that 80-20 analysis, that Pareto's law. 20% of our suppliers are a big part of the spend. That's one focus. And then the other slant, which you just said, is which suppliers are actually critical, meaning if we mess something up, it potentially can hurt us. Which ones really don't matter. We really should have 2 or even 3 different processes we're going to follow depending on the nature of the supplier and their profile. And you could probably argue that as much as 80% of the work we're doing today or stuff that we probably don't need to do could be automated. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, 100%.
Wow. I want to make sure I understood that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, for example, one large organization that we helped, the process was for the supplier to go in and fill out a form with a lot of information. That information was then brought into another screen and typed into the accounting system by a clerk, who then would log into a website, into TinCheck, to see if the W-9 information that they sent you matched to what the IRS had on file. She would then screenshot that, date it, and then upload that into the system. And she would do the same thing with banking details and the OFAC check.
Yikes.
And we basically, with Focal Point, they can fill out the information, and we do those 3 things like in a 2 or 3 second API call, and then say, yeah, looks good, we can move on now. And the good thing here is you can repeat that process as often as you want. If you want to just revalidate that information you have is still good. Which is a good idea.
That's earth moving. If you think about it, as much as 80% of the work everybody's doing today can be diverted into stuff that actually matters.
Yep. Wow. And the next thing on the process path is you probably have a lot of providers already in your organization, right? So you need to talk to them about what you already have. So I talked about accounting and accounts payable. They probably have some solutions that can meet your needs. Like they may have a contract management database that you are licensed for but aren't using. You may have a requisitioning tool or a purchase order tool that you're not using. So figure out what you have so that you don't necessarily buy something else you don't need. But let's assume that you don't have it, is on to my third point. Rather than going through a long process to buy new technology, see what exists out there. Connect the dots with the capability that you have. So you can say, look, rather than replacing a bunch of tools, you can build on top of that a workflow tool that can connect the dots together rather than having to spend, time and effort replacing everything. And what I find is that, if you just string the things together in a better way, the resistance to change is not as high because you're using the tools that people already know how to use, rather than sort of just ripping and replacing it and tying up the organization for months.
Exactly. So if I could ask a question here, one of the things I hear a lot, there's lots of mergers and acquisitions. There's the integration side of it, and then there's the divestiture side, right? And I see organizations struggling a lot with, I have Oracle in this shop, and I got SAP in that shop, and now we got to make everybody go to SAP. Oh my God, that is just brain surgery for the organization. Are you suggesting that it's possible to not need to do that?
Well, there are many reasons why you probably should do that, because if you have multiple ledgers, for example, it becomes hard to clear the books at the end of the day, right? So, but it is extremely painful to switch ERPs. Even if you have two versions of Oracle or two versions of SAP, they could be implemented very differently. So there is a lot to be said for having a consistent way of doing your accounting and your reporting. But there are, it depends what you're using it for. Like we at Focal Point, we often bring in data from multiple ERPs or accounting systems, and we basically clean that data up and we normalize it so that you can see how much money are you spending with supplier X with all the different misspellings of the name across multiple ERPs. But if you have a transaction process where you say, I want to buy something, you can go in, put things in your catalog and cart, and based on where that person sits, we know which ERP to send that PO to. A lot of that can be done, but I still would want to have one accounting platform if I'm being totally honest.
Well, I agree with that, but that would like change the world with respect to, I don't have to stop the world and spend the next 6 to 12 months integrating these ERP systems. You can actually get the benefit of what we've talked about and take a more orderly, pragmatic approach to finishing up that ERP part. In other words, back to what parts need to be first, second, third, and stuff could be delayed that isn't, that we can cover for and give ourselves a little breathing room. So thank you. I was just curious, because I see that a lot in the marketplace.
Yep. And I've been through a few of them myself. Painful stuff.
Cool. Anything else from an advice perspective before we get into wrap up here?
Well, what I will say is this, like if you haven't delved into procurement, typically, let's say an organization is $1 billion top line organization. They probably are spending $400 to $500 million on goods and services per year. Some of it is untouchable, like legal fees and those kinds of things, but the vast majority of it will be touchable, right? And if you're doing this for the first time, depending on which consultant you ask, it's somewhere between 5 and 30% opportunity of cost takeout. So, you kind of think about it. If you can actually save, $100 million in over 3 years as you're going through the spend, it more than pays for itself. And the beautiful thing about this is that it's recurring cost takeout and is much cheaper than sales, right? You don't need a 9 to 12 month sales process. You don't need to pay commissions or anything like that, right? It's just, this rolls directly down to your bottom line. So if you're thinking about, oh my God, I have to spend money on infrastructure to do it. Yeah, you might, but it more than pays for itself. And that's why procurement is still, in my point of view, really, really valuable business tool. That's why I love this industry.
So for the average organization, I want to take it one additional step here. Let's take it beyond just the spend savings, right? For price reductions and demand management, allowing us to do a lot of cool stuff and better cash flow. But what about just straight up productivity improvement for the entire procurement team? What delta would you expect on that? Because at the end of the day, we have to do more with less people.
Yes, we see that a lot. And I think there's a lot of good technology out there now that can automate a significant amount of it and take out the tedious work. We talked about some of them through API automation. And now you can sort of, even with Focal Point, basically a lot of customers, internal customers, can self-service. You guide them to the right place. You make it easy to sort of say, I want this, it's on contract, I get my manager's approval, and off you go. So it's not the procurement of the past where you have to go through a whole lengthy process and collect 18 bits and that kind of stuff. It's becoming much more user-friendly. And I think right-sizing the process and then automating it is the right thing to do. There's still some things that you're going to have to do, like the hardcore ways. If you're going to outsource something, like, you have to do the work, but don't treat every single thing like that.
Exactly. We're back to 2 or 3 or even 4 different processes, depending on the nature of what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. So it was like really fantastic advice in a very short amount of time. Got my head spinning on a couple of things I hadn't quite thought of that way before. So thank you for sharing that.
My pleasure.
So I'm going to bet there's folks out there like, I learned something here today I might want to learn more about or understand more about the Focal Point solution. What's the best way for folks to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so my website is getfocalpoint.com. That's by far the best way of reaching me. You can also look me up on LinkedIn, where I post almost daily about procurement and what we do. But yeah, getfocalpoint.com.
All right. Anders, awesome job. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, sir. Have a great afternoon.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining Metapod. For requests on topics or to ask questions, you can connect with Ron Crabtree 3 ways: via email at metapod@metaexperts.com, via LinkedIn, or by calling him directly at 734-425-1455, extension 103. Lastly, if you love the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. We truly appreciate all your support.